The vast chamber of the Galactic Council was filled with the murmurs of dozens of alien species, their voices blending into a low hum of authority and arrogance. At the center of the Grand Hall, a holographic image of Earth rotated slowly, glowing under the flickering lights of the Council's chamber. Supreme Chancellor Vorax, a towering reptilian being with golden scales, rose from his seat and addressed the assembly. "Humanity," he declared, his voice cold and commanding, "has grown reckless. They refuse to acknowledge our authority, and their expansion into space has gone unchecked. It is time they learn their place." The gathered members nodded in agreement. For centuries, the Galactic Council had maintained control over the known universe, deciding which civilizations could rise and which would fall. Now, they saw humanity as a growing threat, one that needed to be dealt with before it could challenge their dominance. A message was prepared, a final ultimatum: surrender and submit to the Council's rule, or face annihilation. When the transmission reached Earth, the reaction was swift but divided. World leaders gathered in an emergency meeting, their faces grim as they listened to the demand. The message was simple: humanity would become a vassal state, obeying the will of the Council, paying tribute, and ceasing all military expansion. In return, they would be allowed to exist under the Council's protection. The alternative was extinction. Many believed that resistance was impossible. The Galactic Council controlled thousands of star systems. Their fleets were massive, their technology centuries ahead of humanity's. Earth was still new to the stars, its forces untested in interstellar warfare. There were voices calling for surrender, claiming that survival was more important than pride. But others saw the truth. This was not protection. This was enslavement. If humanity submitted now, they would never be free again. Deep inside a classified military base, General Marcus Hale watched the transmission in silence. His jaw tightened as he replayed the words of the Council's demand. He had fought in countless battles, but never against an enemy this powerful. Yet he knew one thing: humans were not cowards. The history of Earth was written in blood and struggle. No empire, no invader had ever broken the spirit of humanity. "We were born in war," he muttered, standing up. "And we will not bow now." Across Earth, preparations began. Scientists worked around the clock, unlocking the final stages of humanity's hidden technological advancements. Secret weapons that had been in development for decades were now being activated. Fleets of warships, still untested, were being deployed in hidden locations. Humanity was preparing for the worst, but one thing was certain: they would not surrender without a fight. The deadline given by the Galactic Council passed without a response from Earth. Across the galaxy, the ruling species waited, expecting humanity to beg for mercy. But no message came. No surrender was offered. Instead, the silence of Earth was its answer. Enraged, the Council wasted no time. A massive fleet was dispatched, its mission clear: crush humanity, destroy its military forces, and bring the survivors to their knees. The first target was Titan, a human colony on Saturn's moon. Without warning, the Council's warships descended from the void, their weapons unleashing fire and destruction. The skies burned as buildings crumbled, and millions of civilians were wiped out in mere hours. It was a message: Earth was next. But the Council had made a mistake. They believed that a single act of devastation would be enough to break human resolve. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous. News of the Titan massacres spread across Earth like wildfire. People wept for the dead, but their sorrow quickly turned into fury. In that moment, the doubts about resistance vanished. There was no longer a choice between surrender and survival. Now, there was only vengeance. In the darkness of deep space, human warships gathered, their hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. Elite soldiers prepared for battle, their faces hardened with determination. The Council thought they were crushing an insect. They had no idea they had just provoked a storm unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The war had begun, and humanity was ready to fight. The attack on Titan was swift and merciless. The Galactic Council's fleet descended upon the human colony like a storm of fire, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The sky above Saturn's largest moon turned into a battlefield of flashing energy beams and falling debris. Council warships, massive and gleaming with the confidence of an empire that had never been challenged, rained destruction upon defenseless cities. Entire districts were reduced to molten craters in seconds, and desperate distress signals were cut off as communication towers crumbled. Millions perished, their voices lost in the cold vacuum of space. The Council had expected immediate surrender, believing that such a display of power would terrify humanity into submission. They thought that the mere sight of their warships would be enough to break the spirit of Earth, but they had underestimated their enemy. Back on Earth, the news of Titan's annihilation spread like wildfire. Broadcasts repeated the same horrifying images. Entire cities wiped out, desperate civilians fleeing, ships trying to escape only to be blasted apart before they could break orbit. The shock of such brutal destruction sent waves of grief and anger through humanity. People mourned the dead, but that sorrow quickly turned into something else. Rage. Across the planet, protests erupted, not against their leaders, but against the very idea of surrender. Ordinary citizens demanded war. Soldiers who had once fought for their nations now prepared to fight for their species. For the first time in human history, there were no countries, no borders, only one enemy and one goal. The Council thought they had struck fear into the hearts of humans, but all they had done was give them a reason to fight with everything they had. In the war rooms, deep beneath the surface of Earth, military leaders gathered in secret. The attack on Titan had been expected, but not at such a devastating scale. Yet, instead of panic, the room was filled with cold determination. General Marcus Hale, the man now leading the defense of Earth, studied the reports with sharp eyes. He had spent his life in war, but this was unlike any battle he had ever faced. Humanity was outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting against an enemy that had ruled the stars for centuries. Conventional tactics would mean certain defeat. We cannot match them in strength, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. But we don't have to. We just have to make them bleed. A new strategy was born, not to fight the Council in open war, but to strike where they least expected, to turn the shadows of space into humanity's greatest weapon. As the Council's fleet moved closer to Earth, expecting an easy conquest, they failed to notice the silent figures moving through the void. Human warships, designed for stealth and speed, had already begun their counterattack. Small, agile, and nearly invisible to standard sensors, they slipped past the Council's patrols and struck deep behind enemy lines. One by one, key supply routes were destroyed, fuel depots set ablaze, communication relays sabotaged. The Council's forces, which had never faced such tactics before, found themselves in chaos. Battleships that had once moved in perfect formation were now stranded without fuel, their crews left confused as they drifted helplessly in the vast emptiness of space. This was not a war of sheer power. It was a war of strategy, and humanity was proving to be far deadlier than the Council had anticipated. The first major battle came not above Earth, but in the silent darkness of the asteroid belt. A Council fleet, expecting to push straight toward Earth without resistance, suddenly found itself ambushed. Human warships emerged from the shadows, launching precise and devastating strikes. They did not stay to fight head-on, but disappeared just as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind wreckage and confusion. The Council's admirals, used to enemies surrendering after the first show of force, could not comprehend what was happening. They had fought wars before, but never against an enemy that refused to fight by the rules. Humanity was not a weak, frightened species. It was a predator that had learned to strike when the enemy least expected. As the battle raged across the system, something unexpected happened. Other species, long oppressed by the Council's rule, began to take notice. For centuries, they had believed that resistance was impossible. They had watched their own worlds fall, their people enslaved or forced into submission. But now, they saw something different. They saw humans, a species that refused to kneel, a species that fought even when the odds were against them. And for the first time in generations, they felt something they had long forgotten: hope. Small uprisings began across the galaxy. Rebellions that had once seemed doomed to fail now had inspiration. The Council had always ruled with fear, but now that, back on Earth, the leaders of humanity knew that this was only the beginning. The Council would not back down. They would come in greater numbers, with more firepower, more brutality. But it did not matter. The decision had already been made. There would be no surrender, no negotiations. Humanity had been given a choice: kneel or fight. And they had chosen war. In the deep void of space, human fleets prepared for the next battle. Soldiers trained with relentless determination. Scientists worked tirelessly to push human technology beyond its limits. Every man, woman, and child knew what was at stake. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the right to exist as a free species. The war had only just begun, but one thing was certain: the Galactic Council had made the greatest mistake in its history. It had underestimated humanity, and now it would pay the price. The cold silence of space had never known true fear, but that was about to change. The Galactic Council had struck first, believing that their overwhelming firepower and centuries of rule would force humanity to submit. They had destroyed Titan, massacred millions, and expected Earth to kneel. Instead, they had awakened something far more terrifying: a wrath that had been building, silent and unseen, waiting for the moment to be unleashed. And now, it was here. Across the Sol system, human fleets prepared for battle. No longer were they a scattered force of desperate survivors fighting to defend their homeworld. Now, they were hunters, moving through the darkness with a singular purpose: vengeance. In secret military bases hidden on the moons of Jupiter and Mars, advanced weaponry that had never seen the light of day was finally activated. Railguns capable of firing projectiles at near-light speed, stealth bombers that could slit past enemy sensors like ghosts, and warships armed with experimental energy weapons. All of it had been kept in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And now, with their fury boiling over, humanity was ready to strike back. The first target was the Council's fleet still stationed near Titan, the same fleet that had rained fire upon innocent civilians. They had remained there, confident that Earth would never dare challenge them. After all, in the Council's history, no species had ever struck back after being shown the true power of the Empire. But humanity was not like the others. Without warning, the void erupted in a storm of light and destruction. Human warships emerged from the darkness, moving with impossible precision. They did not waste time on open declarations or warnings. They had nothing to say to their enemies, only destruction to deliver. The Council's fleet scrambled to respond, but it was already too late. The first wave of attacks crippled their command ships, severing their ability to coordinate. Plasma rounds and kinetic projectiles ripped through enemy hulls, tearing apart the once mighty warships as if they were nothing more than fragile toys. Council officers screamed orders, but nothing could save them now. Their fleets, which had crushed countless civilizations before, were now being reduced to burning wreckage within minutes, and as the survivors fled in terror, they realized the horrifying truth. This was not just a counterattack. This was a hunt. Humanity did not stop. They pursued the fleeing ships, striking them down one by one. The Council had never faced an enemy that fought with such unrelenting fury. Humans did not fight for territory, resources, or power. They fought for their dead, for the millions lost on Titan, for every voice that had been silenced by the arrogance of the Galactic Council. There was no mercy, no hesitation. For every colony the Council had destroyed, 100 of their ships burned. As news of the battle spread, panic gripped the Council's homeworlds. For centuries, they had ruled without question, their authority absolute. But now, they faced an enemy they could not control. Humanity was not just resisting. They were retaliating with a force that shattered the illusion of the Council's invincibility. Other oppressed species across the galaxy took notice. They had watched, in fear and silence, as the Council crushed civilizations one by one. But now they saw something they had never imagined: resistance. And for the first time in generations, they saw a chance for something more. Across the galaxy, whispers of rebellion turned into shouts of defiance. Uprisings ignited on occupied worlds, colonies that had been under Council control for centuries now rising in open revolt. They saw what humanity had done, how they had faced the greatest power in the universe and fought back without hesitation. Inspired by this fury, others followed. Council forces found themselves under attack from all sides, their once mighty empire beginning to fracture. Back on Earth, humanity knew that their war was far from over. The Council would not surrender so easily. They would return with more ships, more firepower, determined to crush the rebellion before it could spread any further. But humanity was ready. Factories worked nonstop, producing warships faster than ever before. Engineers and scientists pushed the limits of human technology, developing new weapons and defenses that the Council had never seen before. Soldiers trained day and night, their minds and bodies hardened by the knowledge that the next battle would determine the fate of their species. There was no room for weakness, no space for fear. Humanity had been underestimated once before, and they would make sure it never happened again. As the next wave of Council fleets approached the Sol system, they were met with a sight that none of their leaders had ever predicted. The defenses of Earth were no longer those of a primitive world desperately clinging to survival. Instead, they found a battlefield prepared for war, with defenses so advanced, so strategically placed, that even their most powerful ships hesitated before advancing. Humanity had turned their home into a fortress, and they had no intention of losing it. Then the attack came. Earth's forces struck first, using hit-and-run tactics to weaken the enemy's formation. Human warships moved like predators, targeting key command ships, cutting off supply lines, and isolating enemy vessels before striking them down. Every battle was calculated, every move designed to exploit the Council's weaknesses. This was not the desperate defense of a species on the brink of destruction. This was the execution of a carefully planned war. In the heart of the battle, General Marcus Hale stood aboard the command deck of Earth's flagship, his eyes cold and focused as he watched the destruction unfold. He knew that this war would not end today. The Council still held vast territories, still had more fleets, more resources, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: humanity had shattered the illusion of the Council's dominance. They had proven that even the greatest empire in the galaxy could bleed. And once an empire starts bleeding, it never stops. The war was far from over. But for the first time, the galaxy realized something that the Council had refused to accept. Humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They were not another name to be added to the list of those who had fallen before the Council's might. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors. And they were just getting started. The war that had once seemed like a mere rebellion was now a storm consuming the entire galaxy. The Galactic Council, once believed to be the unshakable rulers of known space, was no longer in control. What had begun as a strike against humanity had spiraled into something far beyond their expectations. They had underestimated Earth, believing that a single devastating attack would force the species into submission. Instead, they had ignited a war that had spread like wildfire, setting the entire galaxy ablaze. Now, as reports flooded into the Council chambers, filled with news of lost fleets, fallen strongholds, and uprisings on countless worlds, the leaders of the once mighty empire finally began to feel something they had never known before: fear. Humanity had not stopped with mere retaliation. They had gone on the offensive, striking deep into Council-controlled territories, dismantling supply chains, and cutting off communications between key military sectors. Entire Council fleets had been annihilated in battles that lasted mere hours. Worlds that had once lived in terror under Council rule were now rising in defiance, inspired by humanity's relentless fight. Colonies that had never dared to dream of freedom were now seizing the opportunity, taking up arms, and overthrowing their oppressors. Chaos was spreading, and the Council was no longer able to contain it. In the heart of the Sol system, human war councils gathered, strategizing their next move. Unlike the Council, which relied on centuries-old tactics and bureaucratic decision-making, humanity was adapting, evolving with every battle. Their generals did not wait for orders from politicians. They acted, striking where the enemy was weakest, dismantling the Council's forces piece by piece. General Marcus Hale stood at the center of the command room, studying the holographic map of the war. His face was grim, his eyes cold and calculating. Victory was within reach, but it would not come without sacrifice. The Council still had vast fleets, still controlled powerful worlds, and they would not surrender easily. The Council, desperate to regain control, had called upon their remaining allies. The most ruthless warlords, mercenaries, and private military forces had been hired to crush humanity's advance. But even they began to hesitate. The humans were unlike any enemy they had faced before. They did not fight for conquest or power. They fought with a fury that could not be extinguished. They fought for every life lost on Titan, for every colony burned to the ground, for every child who had screamed as Council bombs fell from the sky. And that kind of war, the war of vengeance, was the most dangerous kind of all. The Council's desperation reached its peak when they deployed the Omega Fleet, their most advanced and heavily armed battle group, to reclaim lost territory. It was a force that had never known defeat, one that had crushed civilizations with ease. But against humanity, even legends fell. The battle lasted 3 days, stretching across the stars, with every second filled with fire and death. Human warships, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with tactics that the Council had never seen before. They moved unpredictably, striking from angles that the enemy could not anticipate, turning the battle into a nightmare of confusion and destruction. When the dust settled, the Omega Fleet was gone, reduced to burning wreckage scattered across the void. The Council had no choice but to retreat, their confidence shattered. The unthinkable had happened. The unbeatable force had been defeated. Panic spread through the Council's core worlds. The very species that had once enforced their rule now questioned their loyalty. Governors, once obedient and fearful, now considered surrendering to humanity rather than facing the wrath of the rebels. Some even attempted secret negotiations, seeking to switch sides before it was too late. The cracks in the empire had turned into deep fractures, and no amount of force could mend them. But humanity was not done. The Council had left Earth with no choice but war, and war was what they would get until the very end. The next phase of the campaign was not just about victory. It was about ending the Council's reign once and for all. Human forces began their push toward the core systems, where the heart of the empire lay. They did not march in anger alone. They carried with them the hopes of 1,000 enslaved worlds, the fury of countless species who had suffered under the Council's rule. Humanity had become more than just a species fighting for survival. They had become a symbol, a force of reckoning that could not be stopped. As the final battles approached, one truth became clear: the galaxy had changed forever. The war had reached its turning point, and there was no going back. The Council, once the unchallenged rulers of the stars, now stood on the edge of collapse. The galaxy was in chaos, but for the first time, that chaos was not a weapon of the oppressors. It was the first step towards something new, something free, and humanity would see it through to the end. The once mighty Galactic Council was crumbling. The empire that had ruled the stars for centuries, dictating the fate of entire species, was now on the verge of collapse. Their fleets had been shattered. Their worlds had fallen one by one, and their leaders, once feared across the galaxy, were now hiding like cowards, seeking refuge in fortified bunkers, hoping to delay the inevitable. But there was no escape. Humanity had come for them, and there would be no mercy. The war that had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into something far greater. The Council had made the fatal mistake of underestimating humans, believing them to be weak, insignificant in the grand scale of the universe. But they had been wrong. Humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They were warriors, survivors, and now, the bringers of justice to a galaxy long trapped under the Council's rule. The final assault began with a coordinated strike against the Council's last stronghold, their central command station orbiting the core world of HFY Prime. This station, a massive fortress built to withstand any invasion, was the heart of the Council's power. If it fell, so would the Empire. But the Council's remaining forces were already broken. The war had drained them, shattered their confidence, and made them question their own strength. As humanity's warships arrived in the system, they found no coordinated resistance, only scattered fleets attempting to hold the line. They fought desperately, but it was clear they had already lost. Human ships moved with precision, cutting through the defenses with brutal efficiency. Every laser blast, every missile fired, brought the inevitable closer. The battle was not just about strategy or numbers. It was about the will to fight. And humanity's will was unbreakable. Inside the Council's central chamber, panic had taken over. The High Chancellor, the once powerful ruler of the Council, stood trembling as reports flooded in. Communications failing, defenses breached, fleets destroyed. The unthinkable was happening. The Council had believed themselves invincible, beyond the reach of any threat. But now, as the final doors were blown open and human soldiers stormed into the chamber, they realized the truth. They had lost. The humans did not waste time with speeches or negotiations. The Council's crimes were too great, their hands too stained with blood. One by one, the rulers of the old empire were taken down, their reign ending in the very halls where they had once declared war on humanity. It was over. The Council was no more. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The empire that had ruled with an iron fist had fallen. The species that had lived in fear, forced into servitude, now looked to the humans not as conquerors, but as liberators. Worlds that had once been chained under Council rule now celebrated their freedom. Revolutions erupted in every corner of the galaxy as colonies rose up to take back control of their own destinies. Humanity had done the impossible. Not only had they defeated the greatest power in the galaxy, but they had also shattered the very foundation of tyranny that had controlled countless lives. But victory was only the beginning. The fall of the Council left behind a galaxy in chaos. The power vacuum threatened to bring further war as various factions sought to claim control. Humanity knew they could not rule the galaxy alone, nor did they desire to. They had fought not for conquest, but for justice, for survival. Instead of replacing the Council with another empire, they proposed something new, a coalition of free worlds, where no single species would hold dominion over others, a system where every race, every civilization, had a voice. It was an idea that many had never dared to dream of, yet now it was possible. Leaders from liberated worlds gathered, forming the first council of the new era, not one based on fear and control, but on cooperation and mutual survival. Humanity had proven that strength did not come from oppression, but from unity. And as the first meetings began, as alliances were formed and treaties were signed, the foundation of a new galactic order was laid. But the scars of war would not fade easily. Humanity had paid a heavy price for this victory. Many of their own had been lost in the fight, and Earth itself still bore the wounds of the first attack. The cost had been great, but the reward was greater, a future where no species would ever again suffer under tyranny. As the first human representatives stood before the newly formed Galactic Coalition, they spoke not of conquest, but of peace. "We did not seek war," they declared, "but we did what we must. And now we offer a new path, a future where strength is not measured by how many worlds one controls, but by how many one protects." And so, the galaxy entered a new era. The age of the Council was over. The age of humanity and the unity they had forged had begun.